Dan here with the third of one of our 7 signs in the run-up to Easter. Each day we're looking at one of the 7 signs from the Gospel of John that reveals to us something about who Jesus is. Now, we're in a lockdown at the minute, and for some of us, that means we're busier than ever. Others of us, perhaps it's been a time when we can just slow down and maybe take some rest, right? Now, rest is an important theme in the Bible. In fact, God gave his people a day of rest. It was called the Sabbath. One day a week, they would have this day of rest. They wouldn't work, and they would use it to rest and worship God. And that day of rest went beyond just the day, but pointed to God's ultimate eternal Sabbath rest, when he would eradicate sin from the world and bring his peace and rest and joy forevermore. Now, in our sign today, Jesus performs his miracle, his sign, on a Sabbath. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and he comes across this man who's been paralyzed for 38 years. I mean, imagine that. And he comes to this man, and he's totally helpless. He says he's got no one to help him. But Jesus asks him this really odd question. He says, "Do you want to be healed?" I mean, of course he wants to be healed. The guy's paralyzed. And so Jesus, in his mercy and in his power and his grace, he heals this paralyzed man. And so the man gets up, he picks up his stuff and begins to walk away. But this brought him to the attention of the religious Jews, who, for them, walking around carrying stuff on the Sabbath, well, that was work. And so you're breaking the Sabbath. You see, they'd come up with all of these rules for how you ought to keep the Sabbath, and carrying stuff was a big no-no. I mean, forget the fact the guy had just been healed. No, he was now a Sabbath breaker. And then when they find out that Jesus was the one who did the healing, well, that was a work, wasn't it? And so, well, now Jesus is in trouble. Really, they were looking up for a way to accuse Jesus. Jesus is a Sabbath breaker now. But Jesus says something really interesting. When they begin to accuse him, he says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. And now Jesus is getting himself into even more trouble, because now he was claiming, as far as the Jews were concerned, that he was equal with God. He was God's son and therefore equal with God. So now he's not just a Sabbath breaker, he's a blasphemer as well. But Jesus goes even further than this. This is all happening in John chapter 5. And on in chapter 5, Jesus goes further. He says the work that God has given him to do specifically involves 2 things: to judge and to give life. To judge and to give life. And he says, all must honor the Son. All must honor the Son. And to not honor the Son, honor Jesus, you're really rejecting God. Now, sadly, the religious leaders were rejecting Jesus. They just couldn't accept that Jesus was here doing God's work of bringing Sabbath rest, which is exactly what he was doing in the healing of that paralyzed man. You see, Jesus didn't fit with their worldview, the way they understood God, the way they understood the world, the way they understood themselves. Jesus didn't fit with that, and so they reject him. And it's exactly the same today, isn't it? People reject God because he just doesn't fit with the way they see things. God and coronavirus? I mean, how do those 2 things go together? And they reject Jesus too. Jesus doesn't fit. They don't like what Jesus comes to do, what his work involves of judging and giving life. You see, as judge, Jesus exposes us, what we're really like, that we are sinful people, that we're broken. We're like the paralyzed man, right? We're unable to do anything to save ourselves or help ourselves. We don't like that. It's not nice to hear. But secondly, Jesus comes then as the one who gives life. That means we have to humble ourselves and surrender ourselves to Jesus, to cry out to him as the one who can save us. And we don't like that either, because, well, we don't like the fact that there's a God. We want to be God ourselves. We don't need God, thanks very much. I don't need Jesus. And so people reject Jesus. But in rejecting him, Jesus says we're really rejecting God himself. God himself. You see, and that's the point. For all our arguments for and against God, does God really exist? And I think there are good arguments for that. The real question you have to answer is, who is Jesus? What do you do with Jesus? I heard an interview this week with a minister called Paul Blackham, and he gave a fantastic answer. He said, the reason we believe in God is because of Jesus. Not because of all of these sort of arguments for and against God, but because of Jesus. You've got to deal with him. He's this man who came into the world, who healed people, who spoke words, incredible words of life. He could control the weather. He raised people from the dead. He predicted his own death and resurrection, and it came true, and he fulfills hundreds of other prophecies about himself, and then he ascended up into heaven. I mean, Jesus looks like God. And Paul Blackham's point is that we believe in God because of Jesus. You've got to deal with him who stepped into our existence, God coming into our world. That's why I believe in God. Not just because of good arguments. I believe in God because of Jesus, who he is, what he did when he came into our world, and what he's done in changing my life. And so to reject Jesus is to reject God. And that puts you in a really dangerous, tricky place, folks, doesn't it? If you're rejecting God himself. So my question is, will you recognize Jesus? Will you honor him? Will you accept him? He's the one who does God's work, right? Who brings Sabbath rest to us all. Jesus says in verse 24, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes in me has eternal life. He does not come to judgment, but has passed from death to life. So let me ask you that same question that Jesus asked that paralyzed man. Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? Do you recognize, firstly, are you humble and honest enough to recognize that you need healing, that you have this problem of sin in your life that's screwing everything up? Are you willing to admit that? And secondly, do you believe that he can give you life, that he's the only one who can deal with you and the problem of sin in your life? And surrender yourself. Are you humble and desperate enough to surrender your life to Jesus? He's the only one who can help you and heal you and give you his Sabbath rest. That's the third sign. It shows us that Jesus is God's Son, that you cannot ignore him, and that you must honor him. You must believe in him, you must accept him as, yes, both our judge and as the one who gives us life. Well, thanks again for joining me for this third sign. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow as we look at the fourth in this series, the fourth sign. Otherwise, have a fantastic day, and may God bless you.